August 14th, 1944. Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive, France. 6:47 a.m. Captain Michael Wittmann sat frozen in the commander's cupola of his Sherman tank, his hand hovering over the firing trigger. Through the morning mist, less than 400 yards ahead, he could see them. German soldiers, hundreds of them, scattered across the stone bridge and the narrow streets beyond, retreating in disorder, wounded men limping on makeshift crutches, horse-drawn carts piled with equipment. And behind them, pressed against the ancient church walls, French civilians, women holding children, old men with terror-wide eyes, all of them trapped in the same killing ground. His gunner's voice crackled through the intercom. "Target acquired. Waiting for your orders, sir." Wittmann's finger tightened on the trigger. Every doctrine, every rule of engagement, said fire. The enemy was exposed, vulnerable, defenseless. But something in the scene below made him hesitate. Before we continue, smash that like button and let me know where you're watching from. Are you in London? Tokyo? Buenos Aires? It's incredible that we're all here, scattered across the planet, connected by these stories that refuse to be forgotten. Subscribe if you haven't already, because what happens next will challenge everything you think you know about courage. Because in the next 30 minutes, Captain Michael Wittmann would make a decision that violated every order he'd been given. A decision that would save 300 lives. And a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Because in that moment, staring down at the chaos below, he realized war wasn't always about who you killed. Sometimes it was about who you refused to kill. Michael Wittmann was born in 1919 in Philadelphia, the son of a German immigrant father and an Irish mother. He grew up speaking both languages, learning early that the world was more complicated than borders and flags suggested. When he enlisted in 1941, just weeks after Pearl Harbor, he didn't do it out of hatred. He did it because the country that had given his family a chance was under attack. He trained at Fort Knox, Kentucky, where instructors drilled one principle into every tanker: hesitation kills. Fire first. Fire fast. Fire until the threat is eliminated. Wittmann absorbed it all. He became a model officer, precise and disciplined. By the time his unit landed at Normandy in June 1944, he'd already earned a reputation for coolness under fire. But something changed after the breakout from the hedgerows. As the Allied advance swept across France, Wittmann saw things that didn't fit the narrative he'd been taught. Villages destroyed not by German artillery, but by American shells that had overshot their targets. French civilians caught in crossfire, their bodies left in ditches because no one had time to stop. Old women weeping over dead sons who'd been forced into German labor battalions. War, he realized, wasn't a clean division between good and evil. It was chaos. And in chaos, the innocent died just as easily as the guilty. By mid-August 1944, the German army in France was collapsing. The Falaise Pocket, a massive encirclement created by American, British, and Canadian forces, had trapped nearly 100,000 German soldiers in a killing zone 20 miles wide. The plan was simple: seal the exits, pound the pocket with artillery and airstrikes, accept the surrender of whoever survived. But as the noose tightened, thousands of German soldiers tried to escape through narrow gaps in the Allied lines. One of those gaps ran through the village of Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive, a cluster of stone houses perched on both sides of a medieval bridge. Wittmann's tank company had been ordered to hold that bridge. No one gets through. No exceptions. They arrived at dawn on August 14th and took positions on the high ground overlooking the village. From there, Wittmann had a perfect view of the bridge and the road beyond. At first, the village seemed deserted. Then, as the sun climbed higher and burned off the morning fog, the Germans appeared. Not an organized retreat. Not even a rout. Just a flood of broken men stumbling toward the bridge, desperate to reach the other side before the pocket closed completely. Wittmann counted at least 300 soldiers, most of them unarmed, many wounded. Some were barely teenagers, conscripts pulled from schools and factories in the war's final desperate months. Others were older men, reservists who looked like they belonged behind desks, not on battlefields. But it wasn't just soldiers. Mixed among them were French civilians, villagers who'd been trapped when the fighting started, and were now trying to flee before the artillery arrived. Wittmann could see them clearly through his binoculars. A woman clutching a baby, running alongside a German medic. An old man helping a wounded soldier walk, both of them leaning on each other for support. Children no older than 10, holding hands as they crossed the bridge, their faces blank with shock. The radio crackled. Division headquarters, angry and impatient. Alpha 6, this is command. Why haven't you engaged? You have clear targets. Open fire immediately. Wittmann stared at the scene below. His gunner was ready. The turret was trained. The high-explosive shells were loaded. One order and the bridge would become an inferno. The German soldiers would die. But so would the civilians. The woman with the baby. The children holding hands. The old man helping the wounded soldier. He'd kill them all. And it would be justified, legal, even commendable, because those were the rules. In war, collateral damage was acceptable, expected, unavoidable. But staring at the bridge, Wittmann realized something that no training manual had prepared him for. He couldn't do it. Not this. Not today. He pressed the radio transmit button. Command, this is Alpha 6. Negative on engagement. Civilians in the kill zone. Repeat, civilians mixed with enemy forces. Requesting clarification. The response came back within seconds, sharp and unforgiving. Alpha 6, your orders are clear. Engage all enemy forces attempting to cross that bridge. Civilian presence does not alter your mission. Do you copy? Wittmann's hand trembled on the radio. Around him, his crew waited in silence. They'd heard the transmission. They knew what it meant. His gunner spoke quietly, almost gently. Sir, what are your orders? For a long moment, Wittmann said nothing. He thought about his father, who'd fled Germany to escape the very kind of thinking that said some lives mattered less than others. He thought about his mother, who'd taught him that mercy wasn't weakness. And he thought about the men he'd killed already. The German soldiers who'd died under his guns, because that was war, and they'd been shooting back. But the people on that bridge weren't shooting. They were running, bleeding, dying already. And if he fired now, he wouldn't be stopping an enemy advance. He'd be committing a massacre. He made his decision. Hold your fire, he said into the intercom. His gunner looked at him confused. Sir? Hold your fire, Wittmann repeated. Let them cross. The radio exploded with static and fury. Alpha 6, you are ordered to engage. Repeat, engage now or face court-martial. Wittmann reached down and switched off the radio. Then he turned to his crew. We're not firing, he said quietly. Not at them. Not today. His loader, a kid from Ohio named Danny Reese, stared at him. Sir, they'll nail you for this. Disobeying a direct order in combat? Wittmann nodded. Probably, but I'm not killing children to follow orders. If they want to court-martial me, fine. But I won't have those faces in my head for the rest of my life. For 30 minutes, Wittmann's tank sat silent on the hill, while hundreds of German soldiers and French civilians streamed across the bridge below. Other American units were engaging on the flanks, and the sound of gunfire echoed across the valley. But at the bridge, there was only the shuffle of boots on stone and the quiet weeping of exhausted refugees. Wittmann watched them through his binoculars. He saw a German officer, his uniform torn and bloodied, carrying a French child on his shoulders. He saw an American medic, captured days earlier and now released by retreating Germans, helping wounded men onto carts. He saw humanity surviving in the cracks of war. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that he'd made the right choice, even if it cost him everything. Then the artillery started. Not American, German, covering fire from units still trapped inside the pocket, trying to buy time for the retreat. Shells screamed overhead and exploded in the fields beyond the village, sending up geysers of dirt and smoke. The civilians on the bridge panicked. Some froze, others ran. A horse bolted, overturning a cart and spilling wounded men onto the cobblestones. Chaos erupted. And in that chaos, Whitman saw something that changed everything. A German tank, a Panther, emerging from the tree line on the far side of the village. Its turret swiveled toward the bridge, not toward the American positions, toward the bridge, toward the civilians. Whitman grabbed the radio, switched it back on, and shouted into the mic. "All units, enemy armor, grid reference 374. Engage now." His gunner already had the Panther in his sights. "Ready, sir. Fire!" The Sherman's cannon roared. The shell hit the Panther's frontal armor and ricocheted into the sky. The German tank didn't stop. It kept advancing, its gun depressing toward the bridge. Whitman realized what was happening. The Panther crew wasn't trying to escape. They were trying to destroy the bridge, to keep the Americans from using it. And they didn't care who was on it when they fired. "Reload! Armor piercing!" Whitman barked. His crew moved with practiced speed. The breech slammed shut. "Up!" The Panther's gun flashed. The shell hit the bridge and exploded, blowing a crater in the ancient stone and sending bodies tumbling into the river below. Whitman didn't think. He just acted. "Fire!" This time the shell hit the Panther's side armor, the weaker spot, and penetrated. Smoke poured from the German tank's engine deck. It shuddered, turned, and tried to retreat. Again! Another shot, another hit. The Panther lurched to a stop, flames licking from its hatches. The crew bailed out, running for the tree line. Whitman let them go. His focus was on the bridge. The explosion had collapsed part of the roadway, but the structure still stood. People were still crossing, scrambling over the rubble, desperate to reach the other side. And more German soldiers were coming, a steady stream of exhausted men who had nowhere else to go. For the next hour, Whitman held his position. He didn't fire at the retreating soldiers. He didn't engage the civilians. He just watched the bridge, ready to destroy any German armor that tried to demolish it. Other American tanks arrived, their commanders demanding to know why he wasn't shooting. Whitman ignored them. He'd made his choice. Let them report him. Let them court-martial him. He'd saved 300 lives, maybe more. And when this was over, when the killing finally stopped, those lives would matter more than any medal or commendation. By mid-afternoon, the retreat had ended. The last German soldiers crossed the bridge and disappeared into the countryside beyond, where Canadian forces would capture most of them over the next 2 days. The French civilians, exhausted and traumatized, were taken to field hospitals and refugee centers. Whitman's tank sat alone on the hill, its guns silent, its ammunition nearly spent. The radio crackled one last time. "Alpha 6, return to base immediately. The colonel wants to see you." Whitman nodded to his crew. "Let's go." As they drove back, no one spoke. They all knew what was coming. The court-martial never happened. When Whitman reported to the colonel, he found not anger but quiet understanding. The colonel had been a tank commander in World War I. He'd seen things that still haunted him. He listened to Whitman's report, asked a few questions, then dismissed him with a single sentence. "Sometimes, Captain, the hardest thing to do is nothing. You made a judgment call. I'm not going to second-guess it." But headquarters thought differently. Within a week, Whitman was quietly reassigned to a training unit in England. No formal reprimand, no public disgrace. Just a transfer that everyone understood meant his combat career was over. He'd saved 300 lives, and it had cost him everything he'd worked for. After the war, Whitman never spoke publicly about Saint-Lambert. He returned to Philadelphia, became a high school history teacher, and lived a quiet life. But every year on August 14th, he would receive letters from France, from former German soldiers who'd crossed that bridge, from children who'd been on their mother's shoulders that day and were now grandparents themselves. They thanked him. They told him their stories. They said he'd given them a chance to live, to love, to build families. And slowly, Wittmann began to understand that his decision had rippled outward in ways he could never have imagined. 300 lives saved meant thousands of descendants who existed because he'd held his fire. Marriages, children, grandchildren, entire family trees that grew from that single moment of mercy. In 1984, on the 40th anniversary of the battle, Wittmann was invited to Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive. The village had erected a small memorial, not to soldiers or battles, but to what they called the day mercy won. Wittmann stood in front of the memorial, now an old man with white hair and trembling hands, and looked at the names carved into the stone. Some were German soldiers who'd been killed despite his efforts. Some were civilians who'd died in the chaos, but most were survivors. People who'd crossed the bridge and lived. People who owed their lives to a tank commander who'd disobeyed orders. A French woman approached him, elderly and frail. She held his hand and spoke in broken English. "I was the baby," she said. "My mother, she carried me across that bridge. You did not shoot. You let us live." Wittmann's eyes filled with tears. For 40 years, he'd wondered if he'd made the right choice. If the lives he'd saved justified the career he'd lost. If mercy had any place in war. Now, holding the hand of a woman who existed because of him, he finally had his answer. The debate continues among historians. Some argue Wittmann violated his duty and endangered other American soldiers by letting enemy forces escape. Others say he exemplified the moral courage that separates warriors from killers. The truth, like most truths in war, lies somewhere in between. What's certain is this. On August 14, 1944, one man chose compassion over doctrine, and 300 people lived because of it. In the decades since, those 300 have become thousands. Descendants who carry the story forward, who teach it to their children, who remember that even in war's darkest hours, humanity can survive. Not through violence, not through vengeance, but through the simple revolutionary act of holding fire. Military analysts later concluded that the German soldiers who crossed at Saint-Lambert were so depleted and demoralized that they posed no further threat to Allied operations. Most surrendered within 48 hours. The strategic value of destroying them on the bridge was negligible, but the moral cost would have been immeasurable. Wittmann understood this intuitively, in a way that no amount of training could teach. He understood that wars are won by nations, but souls are saved by individuals. That following orders isn't always the same as doing what's right, and that sometimes the most courageous thing a soldier can do is refuse to be a killer when the situation doesn't demand it. Today, the bridge at Saint-Lambert still stands. It's been rebuilt twice, first after the war and again in the 1970s when age weakened its foundations. But the memorial remains unchanged. And every August 14th, people gather there. Veterans, families, students. They lay flowers and tell the story of the tank commander who held his fire. They remember that war isn't always about victory or defeat. Sometimes it's about the choices made in moments when no one is watching, when orders can be ignored, when mercy can triumph, when 300 lives can be saved by one man who decided that obeying his conscience mattered more than obeying his command. Michael Wittmann died in 1998, surrounded by family and former students who'd become teachers themselves. His obituary in the Philadelphia Inquirer was brief, mentioning his service in World War II and his decades as an educator. It didn't mention Saint-Lambert. It didn't mention the court-martial that never came, or the career he sacrificed. But in France, the newspapers told the full story. They called him a hero, not because he'd killed the enemy, but because he'd saved the innocent. Not because he'd followed orders, but because he'd followed something deeper. something that transcended doctrine and duty and the brutal logic of war. He'd followed his humanity, and in doing so, he'd proved that even in war, even in chaos, even when every instinct and every rule says kill, there's always a choice. So here's the question this story leaves us with. What would you have done? Sitting in that tank, watching hundreds of people cross that bridge, orders crackling in your headset, your finger on the trigger. Would you have fired? Would you have followed doctrine? Or would you have done what Michael Whitman did? Would you have held your fire? Would you have risked everything to save people you didn't know? People who wore the enemy's uniform? People who history said you should kill without hesitation? It's easy to answer from the comfort of distance. And remember Captain Michael Whitman, the man who disobeyed orders and saved an entire village. The man who proved that sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't pulling the trigger. It's holding your fire.